Hi, Sylvia.
Hi,
How are you?
great. How are you?
I'm good. So thank you for moderating today.
Of course,
We're
it's my pleasure.
glad that.
I'm very excited about this conversation today.
I think it'll be lovely. I've been looking forward to it since we first started pulling it together. So thank you. So I want to thank everybody for attending our panel discussion, Striving for Quality and Equity in Challenging Times. We're so pleased to have this distinguished group of panelists. And I would like to introduce our moderator, Silvia Correa Torres, and then she'll be our panelists. Silvia Correa Torres is a professor in the School of Special Education at the University of Northern Colorado. She coordinates the special education PhD program at UNC, and she is also the research director for the Bresnahan Halstead Center. Thank you again, Sylvia, for moderating, and I think this is going to be a rich and lively discussion.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel today, to moderate the panel. Do we have everyone from the panel here? I can't tell. I know that I see Erica and Mildred, but I'm not sure if Mitch is here. So we're going to start, but he might be, yeah. So I see the message from John that it looks like we're waiting for him. So we're going to start. He will probably join us in a few minutes. So welcome again, everyone, to the opening panel of the HECSE Winter Summit. This is a topic that I love to have conversations on, and I'm very excited that you're here. The focus of this year's summit is the intersection of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matters protests, and the current political climate on our work in preparing teachers and leaders in the field. So thank you again for joining us today and joining our impressive panel of experts as we explore challenges and priorities in addressing equity for students with disabilities. So now I'd like to introduce the members of the panel, and I'm going to start with Dr. Mildred Boveda. Dr. Boveda is an assistant professor of special education and cultural and linguistic diversity at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. She designed the intersectional competence measure to assess teachers' preparedness for an increasingly diverse student population. And her research focuses on establishing the theoretical and empirical evidence of validity and the intersectional competence construct. Welcome, Mildred. Next,
you, Silvia. Hi.
Hi. Next, we have Dr. Erica Mccray. Hi, Erica. Dr. Mccray. Good to see you too. I wish we were sitting in the same table together. So we're missing that. Dr. Mccray is director and associate professor in the School of Special Education, School Psychology, and Early Childhood Studies at the University of Florida. Dr. Mccray experience as special educator for individuals with behavioral and learning disabilities led to her interest in issues of equity and diversity. Dr. Mccray is currently the co-principal investigator of the Cedar Center, as well as the National Science Foundation research project to broaden participation in engineering. Welcome, Erica. And our third panel, I'm not sure if Mitch joined yet, but is Dr. Mitch Yell, and he is the Fred and Francis Lester Palmetto Chair in Teacher Education and a Professor of Special Education at the University of South Carolina. His professional interests include special education law, positive behavior, IEP development, and parent involvement in special education. And he also serves as state-level due process review officer in South Carolina. So welcome all. I'm very excited to be talking to you today. So before we start, I just want to share a few things with the audience. So members of the panel were given some guiding questions related to challenges that we have faced in addressing equity for students with disabilities over the last year. Also challenges in teacher education and preparation of doctoral students, and also the priorities for university faculty and departments of special education as we prepare teachers and leaders in the field in these challenging times. Each panel member will have up to 10 minutes to share their points with us, and they will be answered questions after the 3 of the presentations. So if you have any questions as they're presenting, make sure that you type them, not on the chat button, but on the Q&A button that you will find at the end of your screen, the bottom of your screen. And then we have 2 members of the advisory board who will be collecting all the questions. And then at the end of the 3 presentations, we will answer those questions. Well, the two members of the advisory board will be posting the questions, and then the panel members will be answering them. So without further ado, let's start. We might have to skip the first presentation. John, I don't know if you have the PowerPoint up, or you can put the PowerPoint up. Okay, perfect. Dr. Mccray, take it on.
May I also ask John a question before we get started? I know he's behind the scenes, but I just want to say congratulations, because I'm sure if your proposal defense has already happened, you did swimmingly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mccray. What can I help you with?
That was it.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I wish I could actually see you and elbow bump you in person, but the situation being what it is, I'm glad to have some time to share some things that are on my mind with you and hear from the co-panelists as well. As Silvia mentioned, I am wearing multiple hats as the director of SESPECS at the University of Florida, the School of Special Education, School Psychology, and Early Childhood Studies, and co-director of the Cedar Center. But in those roles and the many other professional roles I wear, I always start out as Brittany's mama and Gwen's daughter. And I also want to add my grandmother, Joyce, who encouraged me to be a reader, a writer, and a speaker. And we lost her this past weekend. So if you would keep my family in your thoughts and prayers, if you pray, I'd appreciate that. But I didn't want to miss this opportunity. John, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. Okay, this is very tiny because it was written by a teenager at the time. So if you can either get really close to your screen or I'll read it to you. This is a poem by my daughter. And it is safe to say that you grow up many times in skin like mine. Between your rise and fall, you become anew in beautiful and terrifying ways. When you first walk, when you first fly, when you first feel, yet want to flee. And suddenly you realize the weight of the world is that of a heavy heart. And suddenly, on a day you were a secret in the world, you begin to understand the duality of flowers, how well they can color the universe and how well they can dress the grave below it. And for a moment, before the fire bloomed, once more in these chests, we all felt like the graves, holding all the world above us in the deafening silence of the soil. Slowly, you watch beating hearts become hashtags when they should have become the mountains. Slowly, you watch bright eyes reflect battlefields, and you wish you were a kid again, allowed to cry and grieve and fight, with all the world trying to save you. You grow up many times in skin like mine, that is beautiful but bounded, blessed but bloodied. You grow and you grow and you grow until they see it as a threat. That is how we have been taught to be small. That is how we have grown to become better than that. And I share that at the start of a conversation about equity in challenging times, because my daughter wrote this shortly after the murder of George Floyd. And the pandemic, which is also a part of our current backdrop, complicates and illuminates even further some of the inequities that communities of color, particularly Black people, experience in the United States. This does not get left at the door when kids enter school buildings. So as an educator, as a special educator in particular, I'm always thinking about my daughter and the children who enter schools with so much promise, as she's talking about, that could just as easily become hashtags as they could become Harvard Law grads. We are in a really interesting time in our country when we're thinking about wellness and health, and we're also thinking about mortality. The country is thinking about it, the world is thinking about it, but communities of color and children of color are pretty much taught to think about that from birth. So what does that mean when we layer on disability or ability, depending on your perspective? That's also another strike against a whole group, whole subgroups of kids and communities that are being relegated to the lowest rungs of our society. So what does that mean for me in my current roles? So I started out as a special educator because I was curious about why the Black boys were sitting in the back corner of the classroom that I was teaching in with another adult, the paraprofessional more responsible for their learning than me. My questions continued and they persisted, as I'm sure many of yours persist. When they persist to the extent that they have, it begs the question, do we really want change? What does it mean to really work towards equity and justice, not just diversity and inclusion? So in my current role as a school director, a department chair, you can think of that in a couple of ways. There's administrative responsibilities, keeping the lights on, making sure people are paid, making sure they get what they need to teach their courses. But there's also leadership. And that's the tricky part. I'm the only Black person in my department. And when George Floyd was murdered, I had scheduled a number of meetings with faculty in my department the following week. And I had a choice to make. Do I put on the mask and pretend that nothing else is going on and just get through meeting by meeting? Or do I use this as an opportunity to start a conversation that had been just below the surface? And so we started a conversation and we continue to do that work. But I also want to caution those of you that are in the same role is starting these conversations is not the same thing as doing the work. And so I hope it's a start. It's just the spark to get uncomfortable together and get comfortable in doing hard things. As the co-director of the Cedar Center, I am responsible for a lot of things, but my primary roles are leading universal technical assistance. So making sure that we have relevant webinars, resources on our website, communicating with our partners and constituents. But I also am focused on equity and access. So what does that mean in a center that focuses on policy and professional learning, from policy, certification and licensure, educator preparation, and policy and evaluation? That means we're looking at everything through an equity and access lens. If we're talking about workforce issues, we're disaggregating data to get down to the nuts and bolts, the numbers and the quality of the experience and the time in the field. In educator preparation, I lead a topical action group on culturally relevant education. And we're digging deeper than just talking about diversifying the curriculum. We're talking about what does it mean to really get to those lower levels, those higher levels, actually is a better way to think about it, of that perspective from culturally relevant education to talk about critical consciousness, socio-political consciousness. And so for me, I enter as Brittany's mom, as I said, as Gwen's daughter, as Joyce's granddaughter. And all of these perspectives come into all of the rooms that I enter. And so as a school director and as a co-director of a center, that is what I'm thinking about in terms of equity. These aren't new conversations. We are just in a period of time that it's illuminated and it's at the forefront of everyone's mind. But I would like to make sure that this isn't just a 1 or 2 time conversation that we're having, that whenever things get quiet, we remember it's time to shake the table again, because some people are still uncomfortable and others are going back to their comfortable spots.
Thank you, Erica. And I kind of want to follow up with some of the things that you talk about. I appreciate that you talk about the many hats that you wear, because I feel, I think that we all wear many hats. But when we are, women of color, in my case, in an institution in a state that is mostly, Caucasian or white, I feel like sometimes people are expecting things from me that I'm not sure I can provide sometimes, especially at the university level. Like when you talk about equity and access, and every time that you go around, any room that you enter in the university, I feel the same way. Recently, UNC started a group that we were explicitly informed that it was not a committee, it's not a task force, but it's for faculty of color to come together. and talk about our issues. And I do appreciate that because it's the first time in all the years that I've been at UNC, for 16 years, 15 years, that I've been asked my opinion about things as a person of color. Mostly I have been in committees, like diversity committees, that we just have a brown bag lunch and trying to enlighten people. I don't know, but I feel like what is happening in the past year, it's pushing the university to do more. But we had the first meeting last week, and I also wanted the president to know that it's important that they know that our needs are very different. Like my needs are not the same needs as a Black male. And that's very important, I think. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Absolutely. I think all of these diversity, equity, inclusion conversations are a starting point for identifying issues within the structure, but we also have to dig down to what's holding up certain aspects of people's experiences and diminishing aspects of other people. Because we could talk about patriarchy, we could talk about gender, we can parse it out. But Audre Lorde said there's no single issue struggle. And so I think you're absolutely right. We have to make sure that these conversations go deeper than surface. Let's bring the people of color together.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so let's continue. I believe that
Actually,
yes, go ahead, Mildred. I'm sorry.
yes, there you go. That was just to say that I'm next. So there you go.
Okay.
All right, thank you. And I am the most junior person in the house. So I am really humbled by the invitation. I'm very grateful for HECSE and this community and all of you in attendees, but our buddies that I miss so much that we haven't seen each other in over a year. So thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to share this paper. So I decided to share a paper, and because in the 10 minutes, I think that we would be covering all of the questions that were posed. And I say we because it was a paper co-authored with my colleague who's a teacher educator, Keisha McIntosh Allen. She is live streaming it. There's a community that I'm a part of that Dr. Mccrae is part of as well, that is very much engaged in this conversation right now. I'm wearing earrings by said community member, Black Lives Matter shirts by said community members. We always roll collectively. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and hit the 10-minute, the 10-minute, don't talk longer than that. All right, so here we go. Remote portals enacting Black feminisms and humanization to disrupt isolation in teacher education. Throughout the summer of 2020, a group of Black scholars affiliated with U.S. colleges of education across 4 time zones logged into Zoom for writing sessions. Each morning, the on-screen video images displayed a range of colorful bonnets, head wraps, t-shirts, and lipsticks donned by Afro-diasporic women. I'm Afro-Latina. I have a friend who has a family in Ghana. Others have family throughout the country. And we developed a routine of checking in, writing for 30 to 45 minutes, taking brief intermittent breaks, and repeating the cycle for 2 hours. During breaks, we shared tips about what earrings to wear to an event, playlists, and podcasts that affirmed Black women. We also discussed the different challenges we faced with family members falling ill during the COVID-19 pandemic, attempts to meet the needs of the P-12 students and teachers in our lives, and updates about the activism taking place within our individual regions of the country or family regions throughout the world. An improvisational decision to come together consistently in the midst of a global crisis has become an intellectual community where we will continue to support one another moving forward. Affectionately described as homeroom by Dr. Erica Mccray from the University of Florida, who's on this panel, this Black and womanist space has grown to include a dozen scholars. It began in April when my colleague and I, Keisha Allen, wanted to get together for a morning writing. The two of us, teacher educators and married mothers in heteronormative relationships, desired to dedicate time and space to our scholarship. Our research focuses on preparing educators to teach multiply marginalized students. Myself in special education and inclusive education, my colleague in urban education contexts. Before the pandemic, we sustained ourselves professionally, but were unable to tap into community-embedded ways of being. We exhausted ourselves by meeting the demands of neoliberal and westernized university-based teacher education programs. The restrictions posed during the pandemic, however, forced us to slow down from the daily pace we were keeping as we fulfilled multiple roles, both within and outside the university. The deceleration we experienced offered an opportunity to reflect and name the scope of inconsistencies involved in researching and doing teacher education. These Zoom morning writing sessions function as remote portals to each other's experiences. During writing breaks, we articulated the isolation that happens to teacher educators who center marginalized children and families, even while researching or teaching in programs that market themselves as focused on equity or inclusion. In other words, coming together, we realized how long before COVID-19, we had already been socially and intellectually isolated within the context of our work. Given our positionalities as Black women academics and our concerns about how the field of teacher education may contribute to disparities in P through 12 student experiences. So we draw from intersectionality as informed by Black feminism, Joy James' notion of the captive maternal, and Paulo Freire's conceptualization of humanization to elucidate several tensions we encountered as Black teacher education researchers. Between A, the commitment we have to accessibility for all P12 students, including students with disabilities, emergent bilinguals, and historically marginalized populations, and B, the resistance we feel toward the elitist incentive structures we contend with as academics within predominantly white institutions, and in the case of my colleague and I, Keisha Allen, research-intensive universities, we name what has been isolating us prior to the pandemic. Moving forward, we no longer wish to be complicit in our own dehumanization, nor that of the P12 students and families we are preparing teachers to serve, and especially not in the name of equity or inclusion. By leveraging our distinctive positions as Black women scholars, we make sense of these challenges, and we identify how those of us in teacher education who embody multiple marginalities, like canaries who warned coal miners in times past, are especially attuned to and affected by the toxicity these tensions produce. So I'm going to show you figure 1, which has been showing up this entire time. And on the top, there's this is a phrase I use often, the demands of the westernized academy. There's a reason why I use that phrase, but basically the demands of the academy, which is, it's elitist, it's prestigious, right? Research, teaching, service, hegemonic rankings, competitive individualism, and then either the realities or the vision for public schooling, which is about accessibility, reaching everyone. It's a feminized profession. And so we navigate both of these pressures. We were navigating them before the pandemic and they were exacerbated. And I also want to share that my colleague, we're very rooted in our ancestors and in who we are, not just who we are today. It's fitting that it's Black History Month, but it was my colleague, her grandfather was a coal miner. And therefore, for her, this image or this notion of the canary in the coal mine is a very important notion. And so that's why we use this image. I want to offer you a couple of, so we don't just whine and complain, right? We have fun in this space. I whistle while I work. And as I contain with racism and death and whatnot, I manage to smile and make jokes somehow, because that's what we do. But we didn't just complain. We are holding each other accountable in this space. And so I'm going to read 2 of the ethical considerations that we wrote for ourselves. And if you could talk back to them, whether in Q&A or through the chat, I asked if we can keep the chat. I would love some feedback because we think that this is not unique to us. I think we're just a little bit more sensitive to some of these issues. So I am going to read ethical consideration 1. I like to think about ethics. And then a second one as well. The first one is alignment. So when positioning oneself as an equity-based education researcher, which all of us here in special education, we do, it's a social justice issue, right? Advocating for people with disabilities. Then is there alignment between our espoused values and how one, or your espoused value and how you navigate your role as an academic? For example, does the equity-based teacher education researcher consider how engagement with research activities, teaching, and service impacts multiply minoritized educators and P-12 learners? Although university structures provide less rewards for teaching and service, and empirical and theoretical contributions are of utmost importance, to claim to focus on equity and inclusion in P-12 schooling while engaging in self-aggrandizing and self-serving moves is antithetical to the purpose of this work. So we ask each other, and we recognize and name that these competing messages in education researchers and naming these questions, right, will help us recognize and perhaps resist the disciplining that trains us to represent ableist, imperial, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy's interests. Moreover, if there are instances where concessions must be made, and I do make concessions in the academy, then the question of alignment helps us to move with intentionality and clarity so that I or we don't overstate the libertary agendas in our role as academics. That's one consideration. The second question is related to peer review and community evaluations. When articulating and assessing the quality of equity-based education research activities, how are the communities that teacher educators claim to support informing evaluative dynamics? As Black women academics committed to teacher education, one of the most disheartening aspects of receiving negative evaluations from predominantly white peers or students or whatever is the challenge of parsing out what is constructive feedback from white supremacist, capitalistic, patriarchal resistance to our work. Instead of dismissing student evaluations altogether, we have learned of Black women colleagues who have created student feedback or other types of feedback questionnaires centered on equity and justice. As tenure-earning researchers, we find the critiques colleagues offer helpful for conveying our intellectual contributions to academic communities. But it is not only important to receive individualized affirmations, we also desire critical feedback that interrogates our contributions to solutions and the betterment of those most affected by multiply marginalized identities. So, the conceptualizing of critical race practices articulates the interplay between theory, practice, and community to assure that my own knowledge making is grounded in the lived experience of those who are consistently subjugated within oppressive institutions, sometimes even P-12 or the Westernized Academy. So I'm gonna stop at that point, but I wanted to jump in, Silvia. I hope you understand why, because when you were talking about these spaces that you navigate or, finally like an affinity space, right? And it's not just a brown bag, it really resonated with me quite a bit. And this paper and how we're conceptualizing how we're not gonna go back to the way things were before the pandemic in terms of the social isolation that existed prior to the slowdown. So thank you, everyone. I'm gonna read the feedback.
I agree with you. Thank you for jumping in. There were many things that you were talking about that resonated with me. When you're talking about, I don't know, coming back to what I said earlier, but then something that you said about feedback from colleagues, that made me think of some instances that I think I feel more comfortable talking about now, perhaps because where we are right now and things that are happening, about microaggressions from colleagues that perhaps they don't believe that's what they're doing, but I have been, told by colleagues a colleague who's a friend that, I'm a Puerto Rican with attitude. Just jokingly, but perhaps that person doesn't know how much that impacts me on my work, right? So I appreciate what you said and like the feedback and the whole evaluation process and all that. I totally agree with you. So thank you. Mitch, welcome. We did introductions. I don't know, you probably missed them. So we want to welcome you to the panel and take it on. You're muted.
I think after the 500th Zoom meeting, I'd be used to this and unmuting myself.
You'll do it. Thank you.
At any rate, my name is Mitch Yell, and I am from the University of South Carolina. I'm a professor in special education. And what I wanted to do is just talk real briefly in the 10 minutes about issues that I have seen that really have, during this COVID-19, have exposed some real problems with students with disabilities, and possibly, and how we need to look at this from the standpoint of university professors. First off, I just wanted to spend a few minutes on what COVID-19 has done with respect to the education of youngsters with disabilities, because really the Individuals with Disabilities Act, Section 1940, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act just did not anticipate these sorts of, did not anticipate that schools would be closed for an extended period of time. Two problems. One is that education, especially under the IDEA and 504, has really been a problem. The law itself and the U.S. Department of Education have been very forthwith in saying that we do need to acknowledge that during this time we have to be protecting the safety of our students, of our faculty members, but we also have to remember that we do have a responsibility to provide a free, appropriate public education for youngsters with disabilities. And I would just like to say, and could you put up the slide, please? Go to the first slide. So IDEA is not built for this. 504 is not built for this. Yet we have to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in the next slide, I just wanted to go through this real briefly, because the U.S. Department of Education has really been doing a good job in trying to keep us educated about what kind of resources are available. I've highlighted on here, there's a page you can go to, COVID-19 and education, and get a number of really good resources. The U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs through their national centers have been doing really an exemplary job. But what I also wanted to spend a little time on is if you could skip through to, I think it's the slide after the flow chart. There we go. Okay, there is an online journal called the Journal of Disability Policy Law and Disability Law and Policy in Education that's coming up. I think the first issue will be in April. It is going to have a number of really good articles addressing these problems. And the next issue after that is going to be addressing equity, specifically disproportionality from a legal and policy standpoint. But the other thing I wanted to talk about that I think this COVID-19 has really exacerbated, I know it's exacerbated, but it's really brought forth, and that is the digital divide we face in this country. That it's estimated that probably 1/3 of our K-12 public school students either can't afford or can't access the internet. And that includes probably about 10% of all teachers in K through 12. Now, this is a problem because obviously it exacerbates social learning and economic inequalities, and it is a major problem in virtually all states, but it's most pronounced in rural communities, impoverished communities and Black, Latino, and Native American communities. I'm being from South Carolina. We have a very significant problem with the digital divide, especially in our rural communities and our really impoverished areas. This problem was a problem before the pandemic, but it's really been given publicity and exposure because of the pandemic. And the primary problem with the digital divide is one of affordability and availability. Now, with the first CARES Act, much of this divide was closed because of the attention and publicity brought to this very serious problem. But unfortunately, according to the Boston group, which combined with the Common Sense Caucus, has predicted that approximately 75% of this digital divide may open up within 3 years following a return to school. And there are undertakings in Congress to combat the digital divide. During the 116th Congress, which ended in 2020, Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina introduced something called the Accessible Affordable Internet Act. In the Senate, it was introduced by Senator Amy Klobuchar. I was just in contact with Congressman Clyburn's one of his staff members, and although this laws die at the end of a session, this law is being Congressman Clyburn will be reintroducing the Digital Divide Act, and because of the attention and the publicity that has been brought to this important issue, this may be the moment to seize the initiative to try and close the digital divide. And I would certainly encourage everyone to go to the Council for Exceptional Children's webpage. They have our wonderful senior policy advisor, Kuna Tavalin, has written an excellent blog on the digital divide, and also has references you can get to regarding the Boston Commons and the report of the Common Sense Caucuses. Could you go to the next slide? Okay, there's a blog, the special ed blog, just spedlawblog.com, that I maintain with David Bateman and a number of colleagues, and we strive to update it weekly. And I'm going to be putting a blog post on the digital divide and the extreme importance of this. This is clearly an equity issue that we need to be addressing in all of education, not just special education, because as I said, between probably 20 and 30 million students are in this divide, on the bad side of this divide, and many of our students with disabilities. And I would certainly encourage people to advocate for educators, for students with disabilities, and contact their congressman to try and address the digital divide within the next few years. It's a huge problem. It causes social and economic inequality, and it's going to be an expensive issue to address, but I believe we do need to address it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you for the information. So I have a few other questions, and probably go back to the questions that we originally shared with you for you to prepare for your presentation. But I'm very curious about something that I have been thinking, and like, again, I'm a faculty of color in a school that is mostly white, at a university that is mostly white, and most of my students are white. I know from firsthand that, and we all know, but from firsthand as a person of color, that recruitment and retention of teachers, especially teachers of color, is it's huge, it's big, it's a challenge. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on like how this past year it's going to impact, recruitment and retention from now on, or for the next few years, hopefully not long term, but if you feel like this is going to have a huge impact, and if you have any thoughts on how we can mediate with the situation.
Well, I can just say one of our schools in South Carolina, we have a very large disparity. And one of the things that our state has been doing to deal with this is we have a grant project where we encourage paraprofessionals who are working in our schools to go and take courses from college. The courses are totally paid for. Their books are totally paid for. And we have been very successful in recruiting teachers of color using this project, which, if you're interested, is called Project Create in South Carolina. And I think it's a really good model. It's been very successful in improving the numbers of teachers who are coming into our profession and staying in the profession.
Thank you. Mildred or Erica? Any other thoughts?
Dr. Mccray, you are the co-director of CEDARS. I defer to you, ma'am.
No, I think this is, so our work, since you mentioned CEDAR specifically, that's actually where my mind was going. We have been working in over 25 states, and every state is doing something good, but there's always more work that can be done. So anytime we can share the good models of how we're addressing equity and access and diversifying the workforce and making sure that all teachers are culturally competent and addressing issues of equity, I think it's great. So thank you for sharing, Mitch.
I think that, the reality is our students who are Black, Brown, disabled themselves, I have some, and they might even be in the audience, I have some doctoral level students who are Navajo, and if you know anything that has happened to the Navajo Nation and the things that they're contending with, it has hit very close to home for me, like very close to home for my students, for me, for other people on this Zoom. Some people think that we're inoculated from everything because we're in the academy. People of color, our students, our pre-service teachers, doc level students, we're not. So even those of us with all the titles and all the degrees and all of that good stuff, whatever's disproportionately happening within certain communities is affecting your colleagues who are of that community as well. And so is it going to affect recruiting? Absolutely. So what should we do then, knowing that it is going to affect our recruiting, and also knowing that both our colleagues and potential recruits are disproportionately being affected by this pandemic? What are we going to do to make sure that when it's time to make decisions about accepting students or accepting colleagues or whatever, that we're contending with these realities? It is disproportionately affecting marginalized communities.
Great. Thank you for your thoughts. What about, I wonder if you have any thoughts about challenges of equity in higher education. I know that we mentioned a little bit, but those challenges that some of us experience in higher education, any thoughts on that? You can talk about recruitment, retention.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in here. I feel like we have to think about the whole process. This goes back to the experiences students have in K-12. If they don't have good experiences in K-12, and I'm thinking now about potential teachers of color, they will go one of two ways. They will intentionally come into education to try to change the system, or they will stay as far away from it as they possibly can, and try to shield their children from it if they have them when they enter those systems. That means the possible pool is shrinking before they even graduate from school. And then from there, we have these efforts to diversify our recruitment efforts. Okay, so we recruit a diverse cadre of teacher candidates or doctoral students. And then what? We bring them into systems and try to force them to leave all of the cultural capital that they have at the door so that we can shape them into, as Mildred says, the Westernized Academy's picture of success. So if we are really intending to diversify at any level, we've got to change the way we even think about recruitment, preparation, and retention. I was talking to a group of doctoral students this morning, and I was challenging them to think about why they're getting into the field or why they are progressing in this direction, so that when it gets hard and they feel like they're being squeezed out, that they remember, this is why I started and this is why I have to persist, and to try to find those like-minded people to fortify you, because it is not easy. And you start to think you're crazy. You start to feel like you're being gaslighted, to be honest. And so if we are going to change, we have to be changing at every rung consistently. It can't be, let's focus on K-12 now and we'll deal with teacher candidates later. And it can't be, we need to focus on teacher prep now and we'll focus on faculty prep later. Otherwise, it's this perpetual churn. And again, if we really do intend to make change, we have to be intentional about it and persistent.
Agree. I think, if we think of this as a cycle, kind of like we're not training teachers of color. The students who are in schools are not seeing us in the classroom, and then they don't know that this is an opportunity that they have when they graduate. So we don't have faculty of color because we don't have anybody coming, into higher education or going through doctoral programs. That's that's a huge issue. I identify with what you said, Erica, and I think that when we did the panel last year at CEC, I mentioned this, that when I went into academia and even to my doctoral program, I went through an identity crisis because I was the only person of color in my program. And I was even told to like, oh, we can help you to with your accent. I'm like, no, I like my accent. I'm not a native English speaker. Why would I ever want to change my accent? And that made me very like conscious of like, self-conscious of like any time that I spoke, like, in class or then, presenting on all that. And I went through a huge identity crisis, like, identifying like, okay, now I'm in academia, like, how should I behave? Should I leave my Puerto Rican-ness behind, or, all of those things? So I don't know if you experienced that, but that was my experience. When you said that, I identify with that.
Can I jump in with that, please? Because I think that's a nice, there's a couple questions that made me laugh. I saw a question is, what are the strategies we can use to shake the table? I don't know who Pamela Williamson is, or maybe I do, and if I do, I'm sorry. But I think that's a great question. And then
I know, Pam.
Okay, good, because I like that question. And also to your point about the, you use the word gaslighting, use identity crisis. These are all very real things. And I just would like for folks to realize, all of us, everyone in this space, that it takes a whole lot of energy for a minoritized or marginalized member of our society to tell you, to muster up the courage and the gumption to mention that they're experiencing something that's not okay. So take that into account, and then think about ways that you quickly dismiss these things, right? Or not just you, we can dismiss these experiences, right? So it takes a bunch of energy for some folks don't even say anything. I have students who tell me that they cry every single day at night when they get home from their teacher prep program because there was comments made about their communities, or there was ways that they were clearly seen as less than. And instead of making a commotion or bringing more stress into their life, they didn't want to fight the fight, right? They don't have the energy to go back and forth about it because there's COVID going on in their family, or there's, just other things that they're working with. They kind of just endure the indignities, suck it up and deal. Okay. And so that's far more common than folks speaking up about what's going on. So I hope that all of us who are in this space, when a person from a minoritized group, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's social class, whether it's race, ethnicity, when they mention, hey, this is painful, something's going on, that you consider how much it takes for a person to even mention those things. So that's one thing that was on my mind in hearing. I bet you didn't say anything about your Puerto Rican accent. You kind of just sucked it up, and it took a while. You're saying it now,
later. So
you see what I'm saying? I mean, case in point. And by the way, I want to thank you for sharing your story. We come from storytelling backgrounds. And so let's talk about qualitative methodologies. I do design instruments, okay? I am Harvard trained. I am special ed trained. I do not deny my special ed background. I am one of y'all. So I do like my quantitative methodologies quite a bit. However, my cultural way of being is storytelling, oral tradition. And the way I sometimes see my colleagues who only do engage in qualitative inquiry or try other methodologies that maybe are not as privileged within our field, and the way that's not necessarily embraced, that's something that I think we can do a little bit better as well in supporting other methodologies that are more aligned and culturally situated. And those are my 2 cents.
thank you. That was more than 2 cents. I love it. Thank you. So now I think I would like to open it for questions from the audience. It looks like we have a couple of questions. Yes. So I think since we don't have a lot of questions yet, I'm just gonna start with Pam's question. And Mildred, you mentioned it. What are the strategies that we can use to shake the table? I don't know if anybody else, Mitch or Erica, want to comment on that.
I saw that Jane West said that she was going to answer that in live. Jane West is the table person in my mind. Like, she has that statement. If you're not at the table, you're what's on the menu. So I wonder if she has something to talk about. I don't know. But Erica and Mitch, I don't know how you're going to shake the table. Shake some tables.
Mildred, can you hear me? It's Jane. Yeah, I think I pushed the wrong button by mistake. So sorry about that. But, I think you're right. I had a group of home scholars, and I was talking to them about, these are scholars of color. I was talking to them about, if you're not at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And they said to me, we need to build a new table. This is like a whole new world. And that just really stuck with me. But, I did have a question for you all, if I can put it out there. Now, I'm just curious about what kind of advice you would have for white allies, like for people like myself and others who hear you and who haven't had your experience, but are, really care about you and care about knowing about it and want to contribute. What's helpful and what's not helpful?
One of the suggestions I have is to question the systems, question the structures, question who's at the table, who's on the menu, who's trying to get in the room but can't, who doesn't fit in that particular group or task force or board, who's making decisions about whom and for whom, who's privileged and disadvantaged by those decisions. So I always encourage curiosity. And a lot of the times the questions that come are directed at people of color, and it can be really exhausting, to be frank. Most of us will still respond because we are trying to fight the good fight, but the questions really need to be directed at the structure. Racism is structural as well as individual, and we do more individual work than we do structural work. And the structure is upholding every bad action an individual can take. We saw this evidence on January 6th. And continuing. But that's my bit of advice. Question the system and the structure.
That is really helpful. Thank you very much.
I will add to that, Jane, if that's okay, that I feel like sometimes, like Erica mentioned, like we have been asked, like we're always asked, you know, these questions. I'm like, I don't have the answers. I can tell you my experience and I can tell you how I feel about it. But there's a lot of resources out there. Like, I think that a lot people can do their own research and be open-minded about what they find. I have found that when I have these conversations with my peers who are white, a lot of people get defensive about some of the things that come out, and they don't see the big picture. And like going back to what Erica said, like, you know, I think she has a great point. I think that racism is real, like all of these things, and not only racism, but you know, we all have biases and different biases, and if we're not aware of them, we're not going to make any progress. And I think that's when I have seen some of my friends, colleagues get a little defensive, that like they don't recognize those biases. And so if you don't recognize them or acknowledge them or are aware of them, you're not going to be able to deal with them.
That's a really good point. I have a colleague who said to me, you know, we keep talking about racial equity and minorities, and you know, the problem we have in this country is white supremacy. You know, it's about white people. That's where the problem is. And for me, that was like a real kind of reframing, you know, that, you know, it's almost like we've decided that it's the people of color who are the problem and we need to fix it. And it's not. As Erica said, it's a system. It's, you know, those of us who have had privilege who in many cases aren't even aware of it. So anyway, thank you for that.
Thank you for the question, Dave. Cynthia Wilson, hi Cynthia, has a question. Can Mitch share any activities they do with their grantees to address retention in the field after they have completed their degrees and entered the profession?
Well, we have our dean, and I think has really done a really good job. He's established Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Education. And one of the things we've done with them is try to work with them on recruiting and retaining. One of the things in recruiting, Dr. Michelle Bryan has been working with the college to help with that. We also provide a mentoring program through the office that stays with teachers for a couple of years and offers mentoring activities, hopefully to retain them. And also, being in South Carolina, we have 4 historically Black colleges within 45 minutes, 3, excuse me, and we use them. We try and recruit faculty, potential faculty and potential teachers from the HBCs.
Mitch, I'm so glad you mentioned HBCUs and minority serving institutions and Hispanic serving and all of the serves and the servings. And so I graduated from one, and I also went to Ivy League, very white institutions. And I just noticed how having been in both types of spaces, and they're not mutually exclusive, there are some really elite minority servings or HBCUs as well. So just, you know, not that they're mutually exclusive, but I've noticed sometimes, and the first people who pointed this out to me were actually physicists. I collaborate with some physicists, and there was a tendency in STEM fields to collaborate with minority serving institutions or HBCUs or, you know, those schools in ways where they're using the bodies, you know, or claiming to be like, oh, you know, we're doing the work. We're in conversations with these minority serving institutions. And I wonder to what extent are they also considered the thought leaders and not just people to write letters for us for a grant. And I named that specifically within a grant where I'm part of a consortium where FIU, Florida International University, has a Hispanic serving institution. Then we have Syracuse University and Arizona State University. And that was something that it was explicitly discussed, that it's not just to say, look, there's diverse bodies in Miami, Florida, but that there's knowledges and ways of knowing and ways of being that can really inform this work beyond just, you know, diversifying bodies within our field. So I'm glad that you mentioned HBCUs. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Right, so we have another question from Jennifer Hills. This is for Erica. Dr. Mccray, how can we transition from having conversations in the work? What are tangible things that we can do?
So I see doing the work beyond conversation is what are the tangible things that you do as a part of your daily life, not just even at your job, but or in your work where depending, I don't know you, I'm sorry, Jennifer, but if you are a white person, you're asking this question, what are you doing in terms of offering your privilege or deferring your opportunities for privilege to others who might not get those opportunities in their everyday experience, particularly at work. And as Silvia mentioned earlier, these are all applicable to different minoritized identities. I typically start from a race-based perspective as a Black woman, also understanding that historically, if you look at policy and litigation, race was typically the starting point for all other social justice, civil rights issues. But I think just dissecting everything that you do on a daily basis, if you're a teacher educator or you're a faculty member, what does your course look like? What's the title of your course? What are your students expected to read? Why? Who? What activities are they expected to do to demonstrate mastery? And are they culturally inclusive? Are they community-based? Are they reflecting various types of knowledge or cultural capital, as Mildred talked about earlier? In your research, who are you asking questions about? Who are you doing research with? To what end? What are the outcomes you're hoping for? Who are they serving? In your service, and I'm framing it that way because this is HECSE and we're talking about typically folks in faculty roles. Who is your service serving? Who benefits? Who potentially loses? How are you creating space when you get space? How are you making sure that your whiteness or proximity to whiteness doesn't disadvantage someone else? And again, I always go back to that curiosity. What are the interrogating questions you can be asking about the moves that you make? And I think that makes some of those implicit things very explicit, and will reveal opportunities to enact change.
Love all of that. I'm gonna have to go back to the recording and kind of take notes of everything that you said. Okay. Lori has a comment. There are some good books that help. What do you think of the books? White Fragility and Just Mercy. I don't know if that's a comment or if it's a question of Mildred.
Have you read either of those books before? I have an opinion, but I tend to just jump in, so I want to defer.
Wait, go ahead.
Oh, all right, Mitch, thanks. So when there's a white in the title in general, so to Jane's questions, what can white allies do to help marginalized communities or my racialized group? What can all of us do, right? When we recognize that we embody some privileges that some of our neighbors, brothers and sisters, whatever you want to call, don't. The way to decenter privilege is to decenter privilege, right? So when there's book titles with white in it, I'm like, okay, all right, I know who's centered here. And you know what? Like, that's not to dismiss the work of Robin DiAngelo and the book. There are many people who have offered really strong, smart critiques about it. But in just when you're picking a book, just consider, maybe I should pick a book that doesn't center whiteness in general, right? Even though I like the book, I do like Robin DiAngelo's book. And I also like the fair critiques that she's gotten. I love Just Mercy. I want to shout out Bonnie Billingsley. She's my girl. I don't know if she's here, but I love her. She's the one who recommended that book. That book does not center whiteness. It centers what white supremacy has done to Black bodies and those of us who are of the professional class, who are people of color, trying to push back on it. So I highly recommend Just Mercy, and I'm grateful that Bonnie Billingsley recommended it. And White Fragility is all right, but anytime you're centering whiteness, any book for white people doing something, or if you're white, or if you want to be white and good, think twice about it, because the way to decenter margin, or the way to remove marginalization is to center the people at the margins. That's my take on that.
Thank you, Mildred. Any other thoughts?
Just to add to that, I think there's some developmental work that has to happen, and white fragility might be a starting point for someone that would not necessarily start with White Rage or any other books that decenter whiteness really intentionally. And I think we need all of it. If you look at the work on racial identity development, there's a back and forth. There's this awareness, there's anger, there's disillusionment, there's all these things. And I also agree that we need to be decentering whiteness, but we also have to get people, just like we talk about with students with disabilities, we got to start where they are. Some of them we gotta get them on the fast track, but others, that might be the hook. That might raise the awareness that's necessary. But both and, not just read Robin DiAngelo and think you got it all.
Right, thank you, Erica. We have one more question from Colby Kervik. Hi, Colby. I'm curious to hear more about how you think the pandemic might transform current constructs in the academy, including doctoral preparation, and how we might all shake the table to ensure we don't fall back in those same patterns that reinforce structural racism. It's a big question.
I would say one thing, I think that, and I talked about the digital divide, I think if anything, this pandemic has really brought out the fact that there's such a divide between the have-nots and the haves in terms of broadband internet and things like that. And in this day and age, that's very important. And I think we need to be working on that. I mean, politically, I think there is a appetite for really doing something about it now, but I think we as will strike while the iron is hot, and really be putting resources into collapsing the digital divide.
Mitch, I agree. We need to strike when that iron is hot. And the iron's hot. It's hot right now. I mean, really hot. And those SATs and GRE scores and ACT scores, where are they, right? Those are these gatekeeping things. Listen, I do well on SATs, and I it's just, I'm a good test taker, but I'm not special because I am, okay? I know a lot of folks who struggled with those assessments who have been far better teachers and educators than I was. And I thought I was pretty good. But, we've been discussing how these high stakes assessments are gatekeeping and leaving many of us out, many people of color out, many people who may be potentially phenomenal educators or leaders or whatever. And all of a sudden the pandemic shook the table, and there's no SATs, there's no GREs, or it's optional. I think that is a hot iron that we need to consider. In addition to the other things, there's many irons in the fire. So let's strike. I like metaphors. Metaphors are good.
Erica, do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree. The time, like I said, these inequities aren't new, but they're illuminated right now. So anything we can do that we can forge a path that will be sustained, back to that keeping the table shaking. As soon as we potentially get back into school buildings, are we likely to forget that we had these accountability groups and all of these Zoom book clubs and the like? How can we make sure that becomes an integrated part of the way we do business? And also the other piece of it is, what are we doing to change the structures? Because the way we're doing things now potentially includes people in ways that they wouldn't have been included before. So going back to business as before should no longer be an option. And if it is, then we've been doing a song and dance.
Yeah, I am currently doing a study with, not related to but with teachers here in Colorado, with teachers of the blind, and related to how they're providing services right now, which is, be challenging, of course. But the of course, I'm asking the challenges and what they're doing, but I'm also asking, I want to get what they think about what they're doing right now that they never thought that they could do, that they can keep doing after we get back to quote unquote, our traditional ways of providing services, because I think that that's what we should focus on. Like, things that we're doing now that we never thought that were possible that we could do, especially teaching a blind student, providing services online. So I think we have only a few minutes, but I see a comment from John Anderson. He's one of the panelists, so it sounds like he cannot. John, do you want to unmute and ask a question, or do you want me to read it?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. So first of all, thank you all for being here. It's amazing getting to learn from all of you. And I guess my question is kind of surrounding the intersection of this COVID-19 pandemic and the way it's impacted all of our work lives. All of us sitting, as you see, I'm in my guest bedroom right now. It's not very normal. And so I guess I wanted to know, this is continuing to push us all into these silos, and we have these competing priorities at home. Evidence continues to suggest that this is impacting minoritized groups much more regularly. And I guess my question is more at an institutional level: what can be done to ensure that we're supporting faculty members during this time and into the future, and especially junior faculty members? And yeah, thank you. I'll turn my mic off again.
Thank you, John. Anyone want to chip in here?
I always have something to say, but I'm going to wait because I'm junior. So I want to know what the senior folks are going to tell how they're supporting us junior folks.
So I think about the junior faculty in my department and trying to help them stay focused on their work, but recognize that this is unnatural. This mode of work, this continued churn, while all of these other things are swirling around us, it's not normal and it's not okay. And we won't come out on the other side able to do our work in productive ways if we come out unhealthy, psychologically, physically, etc. So for me, it's really trying to get them to think carefully about what they commit to and what they say no to, and protecting them to the extent that I can, because a budget crisis is also a part of the equation right now at a lot of institutions, but really trying to help them keep a measured perspective as some institutions are increasing, at least at ours, what seem to be increasing the stakes for junior faculty in terms of getting tenure. That's not a good place to be. It's stressful on top of everything else. Recommending that they connect even with those outside of our institution so that they feel grounded in the work, and that they can collaborate so that there's some work to be shared, so that they aren't feeling like they've got to do everything on their own.
I would just say it's kind of unusual for me to say this because we have Jane West here who put a master class on in policy and advocacy, but I think we have to recognize that we need to seize the initiative. This is, although the pandemic has been horrible and everything, it has also given us opportunities. I think that it's really shown and made more public some of the really inequities in our educational systems and our higher education. And I think we have to, as Mildred and I said earlier, strike while the iron is hot, seize the initiative and try and make some change.
And let's get real, like, we knew these were all problems that existed before, right? So I think that's the spirit of all three of the panelists, what I've heard, like, this is not new at all. So I guess it's time to ask, why were we putting up with so much disparities? Why was it okay? Why were we fine with it? Yeah.
Agree. And I think that's an amazing way to finish the panel, your words, Mildred. Why did we do what we were doing, and how can we just improve what we, and get better. So thank you so much. I want to thank you all for being here today as part of the panel and answering all the questions and sharing your experiences. Lisa, you want to?
I am blown away, honestly. I am so grateful for your words. I think that there are a couple things that stand out for me. And one is that HECSE is an organization that likes to shake the table. And so I look forward to being able to shake it really hard right now, because I feel like we have access to some people that we can really push them on. And I love that idea of shaking the table. And I feel like we are all assembled here for this conference in order to strike while the iron is hot. So I think that you had a lot of ideas and thoughts that we should be bringing to our Hill visits next week, but we also need to bring back to our institution and start doing some reflection. I do want to say that later on in the semester, HECSE is going to be sponsoring a panel dedicated to supporting faculty of color and how we can do a better job of that at our institutions. So we're very excited about that. And we'll be getting in touch with people with that information. I also want to say how grateful I am to all of you for addressing equity and access and some of these questions that we've had from a K-12 and also from a higher ed perspective. And I'd like to thank you for being part of this with us. So we will see you all, those of us joining for HECSE tomorrow, we will see you all tomorrow. And for those of you who joined us for the live stream, thank you for being here. The Higher Ed Consortium and Special Education is very happy that you were able to join us today. So take care, everyone.